Henry sat in his worn leather armchair, the same one he had occupied for decades, staring out the window at the sprawling oak tree in the backyard. Its branches swayed gently in the autumn breeze, leaves cascading to the ground like whispers of time slipping away. He sighed heavily, his hands resting on his knees, calloused from years of hard work, hands that had once built this house brick by brick, hands that had held Margaret's delicate fingers through every storm life threw their way. Now, those hands trembled slightly, not just from age, but from something deeper, something unresolved. Margaret had been gone for 3 weeks now, her absence a void so vast it felt like the walls of the house were closing in around him. She had passed peacefully in her sleep, or so everyone said, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her final days than anyone knew. Her last moments had been quiet, almost too quiet, as if she were guarding some secret even in death. And then there was the box, a small wooden chest tucked away in the attic, covered in dust and forgotten by time, until Henry stumbled upon it while sorting through old belongings. But before we delve into what lies within that mysterious box, let us take a step back and truly understand who these two people were. The man sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, and the woman whose memory still lingered in every corner of the home they shared for over 7 decades. Henry Jameson was born in 1930, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress in a small Midwestern town. From an early age, he learned the value of hard work and perseverance, traits that would define him throughout his life. As a boy, he spent countless hours helping his father repair machinery, his hands blackened with grease, his mind sharp with curiosity. Yet beneath his practical exterior lay a romantic soul, yearning for connection. It wasn't until the summer of 1952, when he was 22 years old, that Henry met Margaret Evelyn Carter at a community dance hall. She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. Graceful yet unassuming, intelligent without pretense. Her laughter carried across the crowded room like music, drawing him in despite his initial shyness. That night, under the flickering lights of the dance floor, they shared their first conversation, tentative and awkward, but charged with possibility. By the end of the evening, Henry had mustered enough courage to ask her to dance, and though his steps were clumsy, she smiled warmly, forgiving him with a look that made his heart race. Their courtship unfolded slowly, marked by long walks along the riverbank, stolen kisses behind the barn where Margaret worked part-time, and late-night phone calls filled with dreams of the future. Henry admired her independence. Margaret respected his determination. Together they seemed unstoppable, a perfect blend of strength and tenderness. When they married in 1954, surrounded by family and friends in a modest church ceremony, no one doubted that theirs was a love meant to endure. Yet, as the years passed, Henry's personality revealed layers that weren't immediately apparent during those early days of infatuation. Beneath his calm demeanor lurked insecurities rooted in his humble upbringing. He often worried that he wasn't good enough for Margaret, that someone smarter or wealthier might sweep her off her feet. This fear manifested in subtle ways: jealous glances when other men spoke to her at social gatherings, occasional bouts of possessiveness that surprised even himself. But Margaret always reassured him, her gentle words smoothing over any cracks in their relationship. Margaret, for all her outward grace, was far more complex than most people realized. Born in 1934, she grew up in a household steeped in tradition, where women were expected to marry well and raise families. But Margaret harbored ambitions beyond the confines of societal expectations. She loved literature, devouring books late into the night by candlelight after finishing her chores. Her favorite authors, Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, Virginia Woolf, spoke to her in ways no one else could, offering solace and inspiration during lonely moments. Despite her intellectual pursuits, Margaret possessed a warmth that drew people to her effortlessly. Neighbors sought her advice on everything from marital disputes to gardening tips. Friends confided in her about their struggles, knowing she would listen without judgment. Even strangers felt comfortable approaching her, sensing an innate kindness that radiated from her very presence. But there was another side to Margaret, one she kept carefully hidden beneath her composed exterior. At times, especially during quiet evenings when Henry was engrossed in tinkering with his tools or reading the newspaper, she would retreat to the porch, gazing at the stars with an expression that hinted at sadness. These moments were fleeting, and Henry rarely noticed them, or perhaps chose not to dwell on them, but they suggested a depth of emotion that went unspoken. Over the years, Margaret became known as the rock of the family, the glue that held everyone together. She raised 3 children, James, Sarah, and Michael, with patience and wisdom, instilling in them values of empathy and resilience. She hosted holiday dinners that brought relatives from near and far, filling the house with laughter and chatter. Yet even amidst all this joy, there were shadows lurking in the corners of her mind, memories she had buried long ago, but which occasionally surfaced in her dreams. Theirs was a partnership forged in both triumph and adversity. They weathered financial hardships, health scares, and the inevitable disagreements that arise in any marriage. Through it all, they leaned on each other, finding strength in their shared commitment. Their home, nestled on the edge of town, became a sanctuary not just for them, but for their extended family and friends. As the years turned into decades, Henry and Margaret settled into a rhythm of familiarity. Mornings began with coffee brewed, strong, and conversations about the day ahead. Evenings ended with crossword puzzles or board games played by the fireplace. On weekends, they took drives through the countryside, stopping at roadside stands to buy fresh produce or admire wildflowers. Blooming along the highway, to outsiders their life appeared idyllic, a testament to enduring love. But relationships are rarely as simple as they seem on the surface. Beneath the veneer of harmony lay complexities neither of them fully understood, not even themselves. For Margaret, there were truths she carried silently, burdens, she believed, were hers alone to bear. For Henry, there were doubts he suppressed, fears he masked with stoicism, and now, with Margaret gone, those unspoken elements of their lives threatened to unravel the foundation they had built together. Henry's gaze drifted back to the wooden chest resting on the attic floor. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, its surface scratched and worn from years of neglect. He had found it tucked beneath a pile of old quilts and photo albums, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden. The latch was stiff, resisting his touch, but after a few moments of fumbling, it clicked open with a soft creak. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, its edges frayed and brittle. His name, Henry, was scrawled across the front. In Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, delicate yet firm, the loops of her letters betraying the care she always took when writing anything by hand. For a moment he simply stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. The air in the attic seemed thicker now, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. He ran his fingers over the envelope, tracing the curve of her penmanship, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Fear? Curiosity? Betrayal? Whatever. It settled deep in his gut, twisting uncomfortably. He hesitated, the envelope trembling slightly in his grasp. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately, to confront whatever secrets it held, head on. But another part, the larger, more cautious part, urged him to wait, to prepare himself for what might lie within. After all, why would Margaret leave such a letter behind? Why hadn't she told him these things herself, face to face, during the countless evenings they had spent together in this very house? The questions swirled in his mind like leaves caught in a gust of wind, chaotic and relentless. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, He slid his thumb under the flap and gently opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly into thirds. He unfolded it slowly, his hand shaking so badly that the paper crinkled audibly. And then he began to read. Dear Henry, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you myself. Please don't hate me for keeping the secret for so long. There are things about my past that I've carried with me for decades, things I thought I could bury forever. But now, as I face the end of my life, I realize I can't take them to the grave without giving you the truth. You deserve that much, even if it changes how you see me. Henry stopped reading, his breath catching in his throat. The room around him seemed to blur, the dusty shelves and cobwebbed corners fading into insignificance. His mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. What could she possibly mean? What kind of secret would require an apology like this? He forced himself to continue, though each word felt like a knife, slicing through the fabric of their shared history. Before we met, before I ever knew you existed, there was someone else. His name was Daniel Harper. We grew up together in the same town, and though we were never close as children, we reconnected when I was 19. He was charming, adventurous, everything I thought I wanted at the time. We fell in love, or at least I believed we did. For a while it felt like the world revolved around us, like nothing else mattered except the two of us. Henry's jaw tightened as he read, his grip on the letter tightening involuntarily. He had always known Margaret was beautiful, intelligent, magnetic, the kind of woman who could turn heads wherever she went. But imagining her with someone else, loving someone else, filled him with a jealousy so raw it made his chest ache. Margaret continued, her words painting a vivid picture of a life he had never imagined. Things between Daniel and me became serious quickly. Too serious, perhaps. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. Daniel promised to stand by me, but, well, promises are fragile things, aren't they? Before I could decide what to do next, I miscarried. It was devastating, not just because I lost the baby, but because it felt like I had lost a part of myself. Daniel tried to comfort me, but eventually he drifted away. I think he couldn't handle the pain, or maybe he just wasn't ready for the responsibility. Either way, he left, and I was alone. Henry exhaled sharply, the sound echoing in the silence of the attic. He had never known about this, about the pregnancy, the loss, the abandonment. How could she have kept something so monumental from him? Didn't she trust him enough to share her pain? But the letter wasn't finished yet. After Daniel left, I vowed never to let anyone get close to me again. That's why, when we first met, I was hesitant to give you my heart. You must have sensed it, though you never said anything. You were patient, kind, persistent in your own quiet way. Slowly, you broke down the walls I had built around myself, and I fell in love with you, completely, or so I thought. Henry's eyes narrowed as he read those last few sentences. What did she mean by, or so I thought? Was she saying her love for him wasn't genuine? The idea stung more than he cared to admit. There were times, especially in the early years of our marriage, when I wondered what my life might have been like if I had stayed with Daniel. Not because I regretted choosing you, I never did, but because I couldn't help wondering about the road not taken. Those thoughts faded over time, buried beneath the joys of raising our children and building a life together. But they never disappeared entirely. Henry paused again, his mind reeling. He had always assumed their marriage was built on solid ground, free of doubts or second-guessings. To learn now that Margaret had harbored such uncertainties shook him. To his core, the letter took a darker turn as Margaret revealed another layer of her past. Years later, after James was born, we hit a rough patch in our marriage. Do you remember? It was shortly after you started working longer hours at the factory, and I felt like we were drifting apart. One day I ran into Daniel at the grocery store. It was completely unexpected. He had moved away years ago, and I assumed I'd never see him again. But there he was, standing in front of me, looking just as handsome as I remembered. Henry's stomach churned as he read, the image of Margaret and this man, this Daniel, flashing through his mind. He tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the words in front of him. We exchanged pleasantries, and before I knew it, we were meeting for coffee every few weeks. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, but it was comforting. Talking to him reminded me of a part of myself I had buried long ago. I convinced myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't fair to you. Still, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Eventually, Daniel moved. Away again, and that was the end of it, or so I told myself. Henry's hands clenched into fists, crumpling the edges of the letter slightly. He felt a surge of anger, not just at Margaret, but at himself for being oblivious to what was happening right under his nose. Hadn't he noticed her absences, her distracted glances? Or had he simply chosen to ignore them, too afraid to confront the possibility that their marriage wasn't as perfect as it seemed? Just when Henry thought he had braced himself for the worst, the letter delivered one final blow. Henry, there's one more thing I need to tell you, and it's the hardest of all. During that difficult time in our marriage when I felt so lost and confused, I made a choice I've regretted ever since. Daniel and I, we slept together. Once, just once, and though I ended things immediately afterward, the damage was done. A few months later, I realized I was pregnant again. This time, I didn't lose the baby. Henry's vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus on the words, but they seemed to swim on the page. I told myself it was yours, Henry. I convinced myself that it didn't matter whose child it was, that all that mattered was that we loved each other. And for the most part, I believed it. But deep down, I always knew the truth. James is Daniel's son, not yours. The room spun around him, the weight of her confession pressing down on him like a physical force. His knees buckled and he sank to the floor, the letter slipping from his fingers. James, his eldest son. The boy he had taught to ride a bike, the teenager he had guided through heartbreaks and triumphs, the man who now stood beside him as a pillar of support. Not his son, someone else's. As the initial shock began to subside, memories flooded back to him, each one tinged with new meaning. He remembered the day James was born, how tiny and fragile he had seemed, wrapped in a blanket and placed in Margaret's arms. At the time, Henry had marveled at how much the baby looked like Margaret, with her sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes. Now he wondered if those features weren't hers at all, if they belonged instead to Daniel. He thought about James's personality, so different from his own. Where Henry was methodical and reserved, James was bold and spontaneous, always chasing adventure. As a child, he had been prone to mischief, sneaking out of the house to explore the woods or climbing trees, despite repeated warnings. Henry had chalked it up to youthful exuberance, but now he saw it in a new light. Was that Daniel's influence shining through? And then there were the moments of doubt, the nagging feeling that sometimes crept into the back of his mind, whispering that James was somehow different from Sarah and Michael, different from him. He had dismissed those thoughts as irrational, the product of fatigue or stress. But now he realized they had been rooted in truth all along. Henry sat there for what felt like hours, the letter lying forgotten on the floor beside him. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, betrayal, confusion, all colliding and clashing until he felt utterly drained. How could Margaret have done this to him? How could she have kept such a monumental secret for so long? And why now, at the end of her life, had she chosen to reveal it? Did she think it would bring closure, or was it simply her way of unburdening herself before death claimed her? He thought about the woman he had loved for 70 years, the woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin, the woman who had raised their children and built a life with him. She had been human, flawed, just like everyone else. But knowing that didn't make the revelation any easier to bear. Henry remained on the attic floor, his body slumped against the wall, the cold wood pressing into his back. His mind was a tempest of conflicting emotions, anger at Margaret for keeping such a monumental secret, sorrow for the life he thought he had lived, and a gnawing sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Yet beneath it all, there was also a flicker of something else, curiosity, a desperate need to understand not just what had happened, but why. Why had Margaret made the choices she did? What forces had driven her to keep this truth hidden for so long? He picked up the letter again, his fingers brushing over the fragile paper as if it might crumble under his touch. He reread the final lines, searching for answers between the words, for some clue that would help him make sense of the chaos swirling inside him. "Henry, I know this revelation will hurt you, and for that I am truly sorry. But please try to understand. I wasn't the same person then that I became with you. Life is messy, complicated, full of moments we can't undo no matter how much. We wish we could. I chose you, Henry. I chose our life together. And even though James isn't biologically yours, he is your son in every way that matters. You raised him, loved him, shaped him into the man he is today. That bond is real, stronger than blood ever could be." Her words were meant to comfort, to reassure him that their family, their love, was still intact. But they only deepened the ache in his chest. How could she expect him to reconcile the image of the woman he had known with the stranger who had kept such a profound secret? Henry's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their marriage, to the moments when everything had seemed so perfect, so untouchable. He remembered the first time Margaret told him she was pregnant, the way her eyes had sparkled with joy as she placed his hand on her stomach. At the time, he had felt an overwhelming surge of pride and responsibility. This was their future, their legacy, a child born out of their love. Or so he had believed. Now he wondered how she must have felt in those moments. Had she been terrified, knowing the truth about James's paternity? Had she wrestled with guilt every time Henry spoke, excitedly about becoming a father? He imagined her lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, burdened by the weight of her secret. Did she cry silently into her pillow, praying for forgiveness from a God she wasn't sure existed? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly knew about Margaret's inner world. She had always been the steady one, the anchor that kept their family grounded. But perhaps that steadiness had come at a cost, a lifetime of carrying secrets, of suppressing her own pain to protect those around her. Margaret had mentioned a rough patch in their marriage, a period when they had grown distant. Henry remembered it vividly now, though at the time he hadn't fully understood what was happening. It had been shortly after James's birth, when Henry had taken on extra shifts at the factory to provide for their growing family. He had been exhausted, preoccupied with work and bills, leaving Margaret to handle most of the childcare alone. Looking back, he saw the signs he had missed, or perhaps ignored. Margaret had become quieter, more withdrawn. She spent hours sitting by the window staring out at the garden without saying a word. When he asked her what was wrong, she would smile faintly and say nothing was wrong, that she was just tired. He had believed her, too caught up in his own struggles to dig deeper. And then there were the nights when she claimed to be visiting friends or running errands, returning home late with a distant look in her eyes. He had assumed she needed space. That motherhood was overwhelming her. Now he wondered if those absences had anything to do with Daniel. Had she been meeting him during those times? Had she confided in him about her frustrations, her fears, her doubts? The thought made his stomach churn. Not because he begrudged Margaret seeking support. He couldn't fault her for wanting someone to lean on, but because it highlighted how disconnected they had become. Their marriage, which he had always viewed as unshakable, had been far more fragile than he had realized. As Henry continued to reflect, he found himself grappling with the enormity of Margaret's decision to keep James's true parentage a secret. It wasn't just a matter of deception, it was a choice that had shaped the course of their entire lives. Every milestone, every memory, they were all tinged with this hidden truth. He tried to imagine what it must have been like for her, standing in the delivery room as James came into the world, knowing that the child she held in her arms belonged to another man. Did she feel relief that Henry didn't suspect anything? Guilt for deceiving him? Fear that the truth might someday come out? Perhaps she had convinced herself that it didn't matter, that biology was irrelevant compared to the love and care they poured into raising James. After all, Henry had been the one to change his diapers, teach him how to walk, read him bedtime stories. He had been the one to celebrate his achievements, comfort him through failures, guide him through the challenges of adolescence. In every meaningful way, James was his son. But knowing that didn't erase the sting of betrayal. Love and trust were intertwined, inseparable threads in the fabric of their relationship. And now, one of those threads had been severed. Henry's mind turned to Sarah and Michael, their other two children. They had always been close-knit, the kind of family where everyone leaned on each other during tough times. But how would they react if they learned the truth about James? Would it fracture the bonds they had worked so hard to build? Sarah, the middle child, had inherited Margaret's warmth and empathy. She was the peacemaker of the family, the one who smoothed over disagreements and brought people together. If she discovered that James wasn't biologically related to them, would she feel betrayed? Or would she rise above it, focusing on the love and connection they shared? Michael, the youngest, was more like Henry, practical, reserved, sometimes stubborn. He had always looked up to James, idolizing him as both a brother and a role model. How would he process the revelation that his older sibling wasn't who he thought he was? Would it create resentment, or would it strengthen their bond as they navigated the truth together? And then there was James himself. How would he react to learning that the man he had called Dad for nearly 5 decades wasn't his biological father? Would he feel abandoned by Margaret, betrayed by her silence? Or would he see it as an opportunity to explore a part of his identity he had never known existed? Henry's thoughts inevitably returned to James. Over the years, he had watched his eldest son grow from a mischievous toddler into a confident, capable man. He had cheered him on at school plays, coached him through little league games, helped him navigate the complexities of adulthood. Through it all, he had never doubted that James was his son, not once. Now, faced with the reality of James's true parentage, he struggled to reconcile the image of the boy he had raised with the knowledge that they weren't connected by blood. Was their relationship diminished because of it? Or was it strengthened by the fact that he had chosen to love James unconditionally, regardless of genetics? He thought about the values he had instilled in James: honesty, integrity, perseverance. Had those lessons taken root, or had they been overshadowed by the lie that had defined their relationship from the beginning? As the hours passed, Henry's anger began to give way to a deeper, more complex emotion: grief. Grief for the life he thought he had lived, for the trust that had been broken, for the woman he had loved so deeply, yet barely understood. He realized that forgiving Margaret wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just a matter of letting go of anger. It was about coming to terms with the fact that she had been human, flawed, and fallible. She had made mistakes, painful, irreversible mistakes, but she had also given him a lifetime of love and companionship. Could he separate the woman who had deceived him from the woman who had stood by his side through 70 years of marriage? And what about James? Could he continue to see him as his son, despite the biological truth? Or would the knowledge of Daniel's involvement forever alter the way he viewed their relationship? These questions swirled in his mind, unanswered, and unresolved. For now, all he could do was sit in the quiet solitude of the attic, surrounded by the remnants of a life built on secrets and lies, and wonder how he would move forward. Henry finally rose from the attic floor, his legs stiff and unsteady after hours of sitting in silence. The letter, still clutched in his hand, felt like a lead weight, its contents burning into his consciousness with every step he took. He descended the creaky wooden stairs slowly, each groan of the boards beneath his feet echoing through the empty house. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that had once been comforting but now seemed to mock him, counting down the seconds until he confronted the truth. He moved toward the kitchen, drawn by habit rather than hunger. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of water, the cool liquid doing little to soothe the dryness in his throat. Leaning against the counter, he stared out the window at the backyard, where Margaret used to tend her flower garden. The roses she had planted decades ago were wilting now, their petals scattered across the ground like fragments of memories slipping away. His mind kept circling back to one question: what do I do now? The logical part of Henry's brain told him he needed answers, concrete evidence to confirm or refute what Margaret had written. But another part of him, the emotional, fragile part, wanted to bury the letter, to pretend he had never found it, to go on living as if nothing had changed. Yet deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. The secret had already taken root in his mind, spreading like ivy over the walls of his memories, reshaping everything he thought he knew. Ignoring it wouldn't make it disappear. It would only fester, poisoning his relationships with James, Sarah, and Michael. He decided then and there that he couldn't face this alone. He needed to talk to someone who might understand the complexity of his situation. And there was only one person he trusted enough to confide in, his youngest son, Michael. That evening, Henry called Michael and asked him to come over. When Michael arrived, his brow furrowed with concern at the sight of his father sitting slumped in his armchair, looking older and more worn than usual. "Dad, are you okay?" Michael asked, kneeling beside him. "You look exhausted." Henry hesitated, his grip tightening on the edge of the armrest. For a moment he considered brushing off the question, making up some excuse about insomnia or stress. But the weight of the secret pressed down on him, too heavy to bear alone. "I need to tell you something," Henry began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something important, something difficult." Michael straightened, his expression shifting from concern to alarm. "What is it, Dad? Is everything all right?" Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. "It's about your mother. About us, about James." Michael frowned, clearly confused. "What about Mom and James?" Henry handed him the letter, his hands shaking so badly that the paper fluttered like a leaf caught in the wind. "Read this," he said simply. Michael accepted the letter cautiously, his eyes scanning the page as he read. At first, his expression remained neutral, but as he progressed, his features darkened. By the time he reached the final lines, his face was pale, his lips parted in shock. This can't be true," Michael stammered, looking up at his father. "James isn't... how could Mom..." "I don't know," Henry interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to think. All I know is that we have to figure this out, together." After several minutes of stunned silence, Michael spoke again, his tone resolute. "We need proof. We can't just take Mom's word for it, not something like this." Henry nodded, grateful for his son's pragmatism. "A DNA test," he said. "That's the only way to know for sure." They agreed to approach James carefully, framing the request as a light-hearted family project rather than a serious investigation. The next day, they invited James and Sarah over for dinner, presenting the idea casually during dessert. "It's just for fun," Michael explained, forcing a smile. "To see how much of our ancestry we share, maybe find out if we're Secretly related to royalty or something? James chuckled, seemingly amused by the suggestion. Sure, why not? Sounds harmless enough. Sarah, however, eyed them suspiciously. Since when are you two interested in genealogy? It's a phase, Henry interjected quickly, avoiding her gaze. You know how it is, midlife crisis. And all that. Sarah raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Within a week, they had collected saliva samples from everyone in the family and sent them off to a reputable testing service. The days that followed were agonizing. Henry tried to distract himself with household chores and crossword puzzles, but his mind kept drifting back to the pending results. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Every phone call sent a jolt of anxiety through his chest. Michael checked the tracking status obsessively, updating Henry daily on the progress of the package. Still in the lab, he reported one afternoon. Should be ready soon. Finally, the email arrived. Michael opened it first, reading the results silently before handing the phone to Henry. Well? Henry asked, his voice trembling. Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. It's true, Dad. James, he's not biologically related to us. The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. Despite having suspected as much, seeing the confirmation in black and white left him reeling. He sank into his chair, his vision blurring as tears welled up in his eyes. What does this mean? He whispered hoarsely. What do we do now? Telling James was the hardest part. They waited until the weekend, inviting him over under the pretense of discussing family finances. When he arrived, Henry and Michael exchanged nervous glances before launching into the explanation. We did the DNA test, Michael began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. And, the results showed something unexpected, James frowned, leaning forward in his seat. Unexpected how? Henry cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. Son, you're not biologically mine. For a moment, James simply stared at them, his expression blank. Then, slowly, comprehension dawned, followed by disbelief. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice rising. How is that even possible? Henry handed him the letter, watching as James read it in stunned silence. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and hurt. She kept this from me my entire life? He asked, his voice breaking. From all of us? Henry nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry, James. I didn't know either, not until after she passed. James stood abruptly, pacing the room as he processed the revelation. So everything I thought I knew about my life, it's a lie? My whole identity? It's built on a foundation of secrets? No, Michael interjected firmly. Your identity isn't defined by biology. You're still our brother, James. Nothing changes that. But it does change things, James snapped, his voice tinged with frustration. How am I supposed to feel about this? About her? About him? About Daniel? Henry asked softly. James stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation settled over him. Who is he anyway? Do we even know where he is? Henry shook his head. Margaret never mentioned him after that letter. But if you want to find him, we'll help you, whatever you need. In the weeks that followed, James grappled with his newfound reality. He alternated between anger at Margaret for keeping the secret, sadness over the loss of the father he thought he had, and curiosity about the man who had unknowingly contributed to his existence. With Henry and Michael's support, he began searching for Daniel Harper, using online databases and public records to trace his whereabouts. It wasn't easy. Decades had passed since Margaret last saw him, but eventually they found a lead. Daniel had retired to a small coastal town several states away. James debated whether to reach out, torn between wanting answers and fearing what he might discover. In the end, he decided to write a letter, introducing himself and explaining the circumstances of his search. The response came weeks later, handwritten in a shaky scrawl. Daniel expressed shock and regret, apologizing for the role he had played in Margaret's life and offering to meet if James wished. The reunion was awkward yet poignant. Daniel was frail, his hair silver and thinning, but his eyes held a familiar spark that James recognized instantly. They spent hours talking, piecing together fragments of the past and forging a tentative connection. For James, meeting Daniel didn't erase the pain of Margaret's betrayal, but it provided a sense of closure. He realized that while biology mattered, it wasn't the sole determinant of identity. The love and values instilled by Henry were just as significant, if not more so, than any genetic link. Back home, Henry, James, Sarah, and Michael worked together to process the revelations. There were tears, arguments, and moments of profound vulnerability, but ultimately, their bond proved stronger than the secrets that had threatened to divide them. Henry came to terms with Margaret's humanity, forgiving her not because she deserved it, but because holding on to anger would only prolong his suffering. He wrote her a letter of his own, expressing his love, gratitude, and understanding, which he placed on her grave alongside fresh flowers. As the seasons changed, the family began to heal, finding strength in their shared history and resilience, in their ability to adapt. They weren't the same people they had been before the discovery, but perhaps that was a good thing. After all, growth often comes from pain, and theirs was a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of Margaret's secret began to settle, not as a burden that crushed them, but as a shadow they learned to live with. It was impossible to return to the way things had been before. The truth had irrevocably altered their perceptions of themselves, each other, and the woman who had tied them all together. Yet in the midst of the upheaval, something unexpected emerged, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a family. Henry found himself revisiting memories of Margaret, not just the ones tinged with doubt and betrayal, but also those filled with laughter, warmth, and shared dreams. He remembered her unwavering support during his darkest moments, the times when he doubted himself or felt overwhelmed by life's challenges. She had always been there, steady and patient, even when she herself was carrying unimaginable burdens. That realization softened the edges of his anger, allowing room for compassion to grow. James, too, wrestled with conflicting emotions. Meeting Daniel had given him answers, but it hadn't erased the questions that lingered about his identity. Who was he, really? Was he the son of Henry, raised on values of hard work and integrity? Or was he the biological child of Daniel, inheriting traits he barely understood? Over time, he came to see that he didn't have to choose one over the other, that his identity wasn't confined to genetics alone. The love and guidance he had received from Henry shaped him just as profoundly. As any DNA could, Sarah and Michael played crucial roles in holding the family together during this turbulent period. Sarah, ever the peacemaker, organized weekly dinners where they could reconnect without judgment or pressure. These gatherings became sacred spaces where they could share their thoughts, fears, and hopes openly. Michael, meanwhile, took on the role of mediator, helping James navigate his complex feelings while offering Henry a listening ear when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. One crisp autumn morning, Henry sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Outside, golden leaves swirled in the breeze, carried aloft like fragments of forgotten dreams. He stared at the page for a long time, unsure how to begin. What could he possibly say to the woman who had been both his greatest joy and his deepest sorrow? Finally, the words came, flowing unevenly at first but gaining momentum as he poured out his heart. "Dear Margaret, I don't know if you can hear me now, wherever you are. But I need to tell you these things because keeping them inside feels like carrying a stone that grows heavier with every passing day. I'm angry, Margaret. Angry that you kept such a monumental secret from me. Angry that you let me believe something that wasn't true. But more than anything, I'm sad. Sad that You felt you couldn't trust me with your pain, that you thought I wouldn't understand. Did you think less of me? Or did you simply want to protect me from the truth? But despite all of that, I still love you. How could I not? You were my partner, my confidant, the mother of my children, even if one of them isn't mine by blood. You gave me 70 years of your life, 70 years of love and companionship that no secret can erase. And maybe that's what makes this so hard, knowing that our love was real, even if parts of it were built on lies. I forgive you, Margaret. Not because you deserve it. I don't know if anyone deserves forgiveness for something like this, but because holding on to my anger only hurts me. I want to remember the good times, the laughter, the quiet moments we shared. I want to honor the life we built together, flaws and all. Thank you for being the woman you were, the woman who loved fiercely, who sacrificed endlessly, who held our family together through thick and thin. Thank you for giving me James, Sarah, and Michael, whether they came from your body or someone else's. They are my legacy, my pride, my joy. And they will carry forward the lessons you taught us, even if we don't fully understand them yet. I'll miss you every day, Margaret. But I'll try to live the way you would have wanted me to, with grace, with courage, and with an open heart. Yours always, Henry. When he finished writing, tears streamed down his face, blurring the ink in places. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, sealing it with trembling hands. Then he went to the cemetery, where Margaret's grave rested beneath a canopy of towering oak trees. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that invites reflection. He knelt beside her headstone, brushing away fallen leaves, before placing the letter gently on top. Beside it, he laid a bouquet of wildflowers, her favorites, and whispered softly, "I hope you find peace wherever you are." In the months that followed, Henry began to notice subtle shifts within himself. The bitterness that had once consumed him gave way to acceptance, though it wasn't easy. He started attending a grief counseling group at the local community center, where he met others who had lost loved ones under difficult circumstances. Hearing their stories reminded him that everyone carries secrets, regrets, and unspoken truths. Life, he realized, is messy and imperfect, and perhaps that's what makes it beautiful. James, inspired by his meeting with Daniel, decided to explore his roots further. He reached out to distant relatives on both sides of his biological family, piecing together a patchwork of stories and traditions that enriched his sense of self. While he remained close to Henry, Sarah, and Michael, he also embraced the newfound connection to Daniel, visiting him occasionally and learning about the man who had unknowingly contributed to his existence. Sarah and Michael continued to play pivotal roles in maintaining the family's cohesion. They encouraged open conversations about the revelations, ensuring that no one felt isolated or misunderstood. Together, they planned a trip to the beach, a place Margaret had always loved, to scatter some of her ashes and celebrate her life. The day of the trip, the sky was clear and bright, the ocean stretching endlessly before them like a canvas of possibilities. As they stood together on the shore, watching the waves crash against the sand, Henry spoke quietly but firmly. Margaret wasn't perfect, he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. None of us are. But she loved us with everything she had, and that's what matters most. Let's honor her memory by continuing to love each other completely, honestly, and without reservation. His words hung in the air, carried away by the salty breeze. One by one, they released handfuls of Margaret's ashes into the water, watching as they dissolved into the vastness of the sea. It was a symbolic act, a reminder that while individuals may pass, the bonds they create endure. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it was a new kind of normalcy, one marked by greater transparency and vulnerability. Henry threw himself into projects around the house, fixing up old furniture and planting new flowers in the garden. James pursued a passion for photography, capturing moments of beauty in the world around him. Sarah volunteered at a local shelter, channeling her empathy into helping others. And Michael took up woodworking, crafting intricate pieces that reflected his meticulous nature. They weren't the same people they had been before the discovery, nor did they expect to be. But in many ways, they were stronger, more resilient, more compassionate, more aware of the complexities that define human relationships. As Henry sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the horizon in hues of orange and pink, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. He had learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about embracing imperfections, forgiving mistakes, and finding meaning in the messiness of life. And as he gazed at the stars beginning to twinkle in the twilight sky, he whispered softly to himself, "We'll be okay." The aftermath of Margaret's revelation didn't just reshape Henry and his immediate family, it sent ripples through their extended network of friends, neighbors, and even acquaintances. Word spread slowly at first, whispered in hushed tones, during church gatherings or casual encounters at the grocery store. "Did you hear about the Jamesons?" someone might say, leaning in conspiratorially. Apparently there was a secret. For some, it was gossip, a tantalizing story to dissect over coffee or share with others who hadn't yet heard. For others, it was a sobering reminder of the complexities hidden beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. But for those closest to the family, it was an invitation to reflect on their own relationships, their own secrets, and the ways they chose to navigate love and trust. Margaret had been a beloved figure in their small community, known for her kindness, wisdom, and unwavering support. She was the neighbor who brought casseroles when someone fell ill, the friend who listened without judgment, the woman who always seemed to know exactly what to say in moments of crisis. To many, the idea that she had harbored such a profound secret felt almost inconceivable. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down, struggled to reconcile the Margaret she knew with the revelations now coming to light. "She was my dearest friend," Mrs. Thompson confided to her daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. "We talked about everything, or so I thought. How could she keep something like this from me, from him?" Her daughter, a therapist by profession, offered gentle guidance. "Mom, people carry burdens we can't always see. Just because Margaret didn't share this part of her life doesn't mean she wasn't genuine in the rest of it. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we bury deepest." Mrs. Thompson sighed, her voice tinged with sadness. "I suppose you're right. But it makes me wonder, how well do any of us really know each other?" Of all the siblings, Sarah found herself most affected by the broader implications of Margaret's secret. As the empathetic peacemaker of the family, she had always prided herself on her ability to connect with others, to understand their struggles, and offer comfort. Yet now, faced with the reality that her mother had concealed such a monumental truth, she began to question whether she truly understood anyone, not just Margaret, but the people around her in general. One afternoon, while volunteering at the local shelter, she struck up a conversation with a young woman named Emily, who had recently fled an abusive relationship. Emily spoke hesitantly at first, her words laced with shame and fear. But as Sarah listened patiently, offering reassurance without judgment, Emily opened up about the years of manipulation and control she had endured. "I stayed because I thought I deserved it," Emily admitted, tears streaming down her face. "And because I was scared of what would happen if I left. Even now, I feel like I'm carrying this weight that no one else understands." Sarah nodded, her own heart aching with empathy. "You're not alone," she said softly. "We all carry weights, some visible, some hidden. What matters is finding people who will help you carry them, even if they don't fully understand." As she drove home that evening, Sarah reflected on her conversation with Emily. She realized that everyone has secrets, fears, and vulnerabilities they guard fiercely. Margaret's revelation hadn't diminished her humanity. It had simply highlighted the complexity of being human. And perhaps that was the lesson Sarah needed to take forward. Not to judge others too harshly, but to approach them with compassion and curiosity. For Michael, the youngest of the siblings, the experience forced him to confront his own tendencies toward rigidity and control. Growing up, he had often prided himself on his practicality and logical thinking, viewing emotions as messy distractions that clouded judgment. But witnessing the raw vulnerability displayed by his father and brother challenged those assumptions. He began journaling as a way to process his thoughts, something he had never done before. At first, the entries were terse and factual, recounting events without much introspection. But gradually, they became more reflective, delving into his feelings about Margaret, the family dynamics, and his role within them. One entry stood out, in particular. Today, I realized that strength isn't about having all the answers or keeping everything together. It's about admitting when you're lost, when you're hurting, when you don't know what to do next. Dad showed me that. He didn't have to tell us about Mom's letter. He could have kept it to himself, protected us from the pain. But he didn't. He trusted us enough to share the truth, even though it meant risking our anger or disappointment. That takes courage. Maybe I need to learn to be braver too, to let people see me, flaws and all. This newfound self-awareness spilled over into his interactions with others. At work, where he had previously avoided personal conversations with colleagues, he started opening up more, sharing bits of his life and asking about theirs. To his surprise, these exchanges deepened his connections, fostering a sense of camaraderie he hadn't experienced before. James continued to grapple with his dual identity, the son of Henry and the biological child of Daniel. Wiley had come to terms with the fact that genetics didn't define him. The duality still lingered in the back of his mind, shaping how he viewed himself and his place in the world. His meetings with Daniel grew less frequent, but no less meaningful. During one visit, Daniel shared stories about his own youth, the adventures he had embarked on, the mistakes he had made, the dreams he had abandoned. James listened intently, recognizing fragments of himself in Daniel's tales. "You remind me of me at your age," Daniel said with a wistful smile. Restless, curious, always searching for something more. James chuckled, though there was a hint of melancholy in his laughter. "Maybe that's why Mom, Margaret, fell for you in the first place." Daniel's expression softened, his eyes clouding with regret. "I wish I could go back and change things," he admitted. "Not just for her sake, but for yours too. You deserved better than to grow up wondering who you are." James shook his head. "It's not your fault. None of this is. We're all just trying to make sense of the cards we've been dealt." In that moment, James felt a profound shift within himself. He realized that seeking closure wasn't about finding definitive answers. It was about accepting ambiguity, embracing the gray areas where life unfolds. He decided then and there to stop viewing his identity as a puzzle to solve, and instead focus on building a future rooted in authenticity and purpose. Back in the neighborhood, the ripple effects of Margaret's secret continued to unfold. Inspired by the Jamesons' willingness to confront difficult truths, others began to open up about their own struggles. Mr. Peterson, the retired mechanic who rarely spoke to anyone outside of work-related matters, confided in Henry about his decades-long battle with depression. Mrs. Alvarez, the cheerful baker whose pastries were a staple at every community event, revealed that she had once walked away from a promising career in music due to crippling stage fright. These revelations created a sense of solidarity among the residents, reminding them that everyone carries burdens, whether visible or hidden. Slowly but surely, the community transformed into a space where vulnerability was celebrated, rather than Stigmata 9D, a testament to the power of honesty and connection. As time passed, Henry found solace in the knowledge that Margaret's legacy extended far beyond the secret she had kept. Her capacity for love, forgiveness, and resilience had left an indelible mark on those around her, inspiring them to embrace their own imperfections and reach out to others with greater empathy. The anniversary of her passing, the family gathered once again at her grave. This time, however, the atmosphere was lighter, filled with laughter and reminiscence rather than sorrow. They shared stories about Margaret, the funny quirks she had, the sage advice she dispensed, the quiet acts of kindness that defined her. Character? She wasn't perfect, Sarah said with a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But she taught us that perfection isn't the goal. It's about showing up day after day and doing the best you can with what you've got. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And loving fiercely, even when it's hard. Henry placed a hand on James's shoulder, his eyes glistening, with unshed tears. That's right, loving fiercely and forgiving completely. As they stood together, united by shared memories and newfound understanding, Henry felt a profound sense of gratitude. Margaret's secret had shaken them to their core, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. But it had also strengthened their bonds, teaching them that love isn't about avoiding pain, it's about enduring it, growing through it, and emerging stronger on the other side. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cemetery in a warm golden glow, Henry whispered softly, "Thank you, Margaret, for everything."